been able to figure out how to.
Okay, great. And we are officially streaming live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. And thanks everyone else who's joining us for Monday Meets. Today we have a very special Monday Meets. We're talking with members of the Douglas County Human Trafficking Task Force. It is just after January was Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And we were one day shy of getting everybody on time, but we are excited to have everybody today in order to kind of talk over a little bit about trafficking, what it is, and how it looks in Lawrence, and in Douglas, Franklin, and Jefferson County. So as we go through this, if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments section of the live feed, and I will go ahead and try to get those questions in and integrated, or if you have thoughts, we'll try to include those as well. So just leave those in the feed. If you have any questions or thoughts that you don't feel comfortable sharing on the comment section, you can also email me at waverill@willowdvcenter.org, and I'll put that in the comment field as well, so you can send me a personal email, and I'll make sure that gets integrated in if you'd rather do it anonymously. So very excited to have the panel here today, and I won't take a lot more time doing introductions, but I would like to have everybody, just if you could, introduce yourselves and what organization you're with, and maybe a little bit of background on how you came into that position. So Hannah, do you want to start us off, since you're kind of top on my screen?
I know the screen shifts, right, depending on who's speaking. Hi, I'm Hannah Britton. I am a professor at the University of Kansas in the departments of political science and women, gender, and sexuality studies. I'm also the director of the Anti-Slavery and Human Trafficking Initiative at KU, and we focus on research and teaching. We do not provide direct services, but we do research and teaching on human trafficking, and we have great partners who are on this call as well. So thanks.
Great. Ken, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kent Bauman, and I presently work for the Department for Children and Families for the state of Kansas as their anti-human trafficking program manager. I spent 34 years with the Wichita Police Department, and spent 15 of those years at the Explorative Missing Child Unit, working missing children investigations and sex trafficking cases. So that's who I am. That's what I'm doing.
Okay, great. Charlie, you want to take it next?
Hello, I'm Charlie Tebow. I am part of the special response team on missing and exploited youth in Kansas, and I am currently housed in KVC Health Systems doing missing youth work as well as doing human trafficking assessments. And I've been in the human trafficking field for about 10 plus years, doing a variety of direct service advocacy work and a lot of consulting on a national level, as well as being a survivor leader and doing a lot of LGBT and child welfare work at the moment.
Okay, great. And then, sorry, I'll come back to that. I got a question for you, but I'll save it till after Corey introduces her.
I'm sorry. I'm the middle child at home as well. No, my name is Corey Green. I knew that's why I loved you, Charlie. Yeah, my name is Corey Green. I am the sexual assault nurse examiner at one of them at the hospital here in Lawrence, and I'm also the coordinator for the program. As a sexual assault nurse, you know, domestic violence and human trafficking, they all kind of intersect together. And so that's why I'm part of the Human Trafficking Task Force.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all again for coming together today to kind of talk a little bit about human trafficking with us. I do want to just remind everybody, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section of the Facebook Live feed, or you can email them to me. I put my email address on the comment feed as well. I thought that probably the best place to start with any conversation about human trafficking is to kind of look at the definition of human trafficking. The working definition that we at the Willow use very broadly is the use of force or coercion to extort labor, sex, or services. But I know that has some nuance in different areas. So if anybody would like to kind of just talk about, what the definition of human trafficking that you're working with within your organization is, and kind of gives a little bit more of a feel of what that is in your areas.
Charlie, why don't you take this one?
Dang it, I was waiting for the other ones. So I think the specific places that we see it, speaking specifically in the child welfare human trafficking assessments that I do, we see a lot of transactional exchange of services for something in return, whether it be drugs or teddy bears or food, hotel rooms. And so while in youth, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, which is what you have to do for adult cases, and that it's the part of the definition is force, fraud, or coercion, and you have the transactional service. But you don't really have to do that to make a case with youth. And so I think when we are looking at the youth victims that come through, they're not always the most willing to tell us exactly what happened. So we kind of have to put the pieces in place for them and read in between the lines. And what we see is that usually it's a case of a youth that wants to get somewhere or wants to achieve some kind of goal, and then they do something in exchange to achieve that goal.
Yeah, and if I can just jump on to Charlie's, that's exactly right, force, fraud, or coercion. And I would also say something that I learned early on is that it also doesn't have to involve movement, right? A lot of people think about movement across borders, that trafficking in some ways is related to movement. But just as Charlie pointed out, this is, trafficking terms of exchange, right? For survival, something like that. So it doesn't have to be someone crossing a border or even moving. You can be trafficked in your own house.
I agree, Hannah. I think using the word trafficking is it's difficult to get around. Sometimes I change the word to exploiting. I think it's a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads around. And certainly in the hospital setting, I'm very careful to describe what trafficking looks like, because it's not a one size fits all. And for us in the medical setting, it's really just about creating a space where somebody feels safe enough to be able to come forward and say something is happening to me, or like Charlie said, just really kind of getting between the lines and sort of getting from somebody, which I'm assuming will get into. So yeah, it's hard for me to describe exactly what it is, except that, yeah, I prefer the word exploiting somebody rather than trafficking, because there is some confusion about that for people.
Yeah, I like that word exploitation as well. But I think some people get confused. There's a lot of working parts to trafficking. There's adult trafficking, there's minor trafficking, there's international trafficking, there's domestic trafficking. And I think a lot of people overlook the fact that we have our own kids being trafficked here in the United States. And I think people overlook that. And then there's also sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So there's a lot of moving parts to this definition.
I think that's great, and thank you all so much for your thoughts on that. I think everybody really did cover really excellently kind of a different angle of that. One thing last year, the Willow hosted Survivor leader Rebecca Bender, and she spoke. And one of the things that she said that really resonated with me in her talk was that trafficking, referring primarily to movement, that trafficking happens anywhere people are. It's not limited to a geographical area or different geographical areas. And I think that's really an important fact that sometimes people think about it more like the movie Taken, like a Taken scenario where it only happens internationally or it only happens with international folks, but it is in fact everywhere. So thank you so much for kind of clarifying that. Just to remind anybody, if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and throw those on the comment section of the Facebook feed. But let's move on to kind of the services that are provided and who's seeking those services. So, so Corey, do you want to kind of maybe start this ball rolling? When you see people trafficking in the setting of the hospital environment and your world, what is that sort of, how does that look? And what types?
Yeah.
What type of work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I already kind of alluded to the fact that it's not a black and white situation, but I'll share with you my very first sort of situation. Now, to be clear, I think this is happening a lot and we're not seeing it. We're not finding it. We're not opening our minds to that, because you have to remember, in like an emergency room setting and in a medical sort of setting, we're treating the hierarchy of needs, right? So if you come in and you have abdominal pain, like we're going to be searching for that, right? And so sometimes we have to do a lot of work to sort of think outside of what's actually going on with the person. So keeping that in mind. But the first time I had a situation where I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm dealing with a trafficking situation. When I got here, again, I do sexual assaults. And so when I got to the hospital, on my way to the room to see the patient, several people had said things to me like, oh, she's a doozy, or, oh, she was just about in restraints. She's yelling at everybody. And, oh, good luck with that one, Corey, that kind of thing. And so the whole way there, I'm like, this is interesting. Well, right before I got in the room, someone said to me, she doesn't even have like any identification on her. She doesn't even like know anything. And I was like, wow, okay, thanks for all the preparation. So when I went into the room, I very quickly was able to assess that the woman was in a lot of distress. She had on clothes that were clearly not hers. There were no shoes. She looked malnourished and she was terribly frightened. She was very worried that, she was going to go to jail. And so basically what I did was what I do for all of my patients is, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Let's get you out of those clothes. Let's get you comfortable. Let's get a pillow. A lot of times in the ER, we forget the pillow. So, I kind of just made her comfortable. We went out and had a cigarette. We came back in, it was several hours before she disclosed to me what had happened. And after that day, this is the reason I'm telling this story, is after that day, I decided to throw myself into what trafficking is, because I couldn't even believe this was happening. And I don't want to share her story because that's not my story to share. But after that was when I realized that, we're probably missing this a lot. There's always someone that's angry and scared and frightened and screaming at us and spitting at us and throwing at us. But what is really going on? And so that situation really changed my outlook a lot. And I actually discharged her to the Willow. And that was a big mistake for me, because not recognizing they had been putting drugs in her for 3 months. She detoxed at the Willow and ended up leaving. And so again, that situation will stay with me forever because I did not handle it correctly. But since then, I've been doing a lot of work with really just teaching people how to approach people in a different way, and understanding that like everybody has experienced trauma in some point of their life. And, how can we get around that? And how can we make somebody comfortable enough to be able to get them to open up about what's going on? And so ever since then, I've probably dealt with, 10 to 20 different survivors of trafficking in several different situations. But always there's something in my gut saying there's more going on, and learning how to approach people and learning how to have those conversations with them in a way that isn't, you know, a scary thing for them. And so it's really hard for me to say exactly the type of patients that we see, but it tends to be around survival. So, you know, survival sex, you know, for drugs or a roof over their head. And right now during COVID, of course, that has just been exacerbated. I've never had a situation, you know, where the trafficker brings the patient, you know, kind of the things you learn if you go to a human trafficking like seminar 101 class. Like it's never happened in that like clean fashion. You know, it's always just this, I've got this feeling. And that's really hard to explain to people. That's hard to teach. But that's just kind of my first experience on this journey.
I can piggyback off Corey. I can remember when I personally reached out for services in a medical setting that like my trafficker didn't take me to get, like if it was something I wanted to do, I had to do it myself and I had to fight my way there. So, but it depends case by case. It's so case by case and an individual. Like, I think that Corey summed it up pretty well, but wanted to add my personal thoughts in there. Like it's what I remember seeking out services for were like if it was a particularly horrible situation, I was just getting symptom management, or if I needed to get tested, or if I was having a pregnancy scare or something like that, I was having abdominal pain, or there was, you know, a joint was out of place, or it was just whatever was going on with me at the time. That's what I was seeking service. So it literally could have been anything. But I was never asked the questions like when I go to the doctor now that I'm asked, and are you safe at home? And they tend to ask way more questions now, but I was never asked any of those questions when I was seeking help.
And Charlie, on that note, can we touch on something I wanted to get to earlier, and then we introduced Corey instead. But you introduced yourself as a survivor leader, and I just want to kind of talk about that for just touch on that real briefly. That is a term that people might not necessarily be familiar with. Could you just sort of tell us what that term means, and kind of we talked a little bit about this last week, but just talk about the importance of having survivor leaders involved as part of the efforts to combat trafficking?
Yes, I love this topic. Survivor leader is a term that us survivors in the movement have reclaimed and coined because of what we were seeing in the movement and not having survivors at the table. And so there's been a number of survivors nationwide that have been meeting for 20, 30 years to have conferences and equip survivors to be able to sit at these tables and get skills. And then, because we have so many barriers to education and to not being able to achieve stability in order to be able to sit at these tables where decisions are being made. And so the leaders that came before me were like Rachel Lloyd and like Audrey Morrissey and all those heavy hitters that you see in international news. They all got together and decided that we need to be at that table. So how do we work together to equip survivors so that we can be at the table? How can we get survivors into college, get them graduated, get them credentials, and get them the skills so that we can be productive helpers in the field? And so that's kind of what that term means. If you're a survivor leader, it means that you have gone through those steps to heal, and not only heal, but become a thriver. Some survivor leaders do not like that term. Like it's still the same as victim, survivor. Like it really just depends on everyone's preference. You'll hear throughout the US of all of the survivors, we all have our different opinions on how we like to be, but I love the term survivor leader because it both shows that I survived the worst and I'm able to function and do the work that I do now, and I take great pride in that.
Thank you.
Well, I think one of the first things we need to do and combat this problem is we have to understand that it exists. And I think a lot of people think that Kansas is, just in the middle of the country and, nothing happens here. And we need to understand that it is happening here in Kansas. It's happening in rural America. We oftentimes think of cities as the place where most trafficking takes place, and it probably does. Kansas City, Topeka, Wichita have their share of trafficking issues. But we also have to realize that it takes place in Western Kansas as well, in the rural communities. And especially since COVID-19 has hit, with the federal emphasis on getting internet services to the rural areas of Kansas and other states, that has opened up the internet to trafficking. And so I think it's on the increase in rural areas and just not in the metropolitan areas.
That's interesting.
And I wanted to add to what Kent said. I've had patients come to LMH from Wichita, from Kansas City, from Topeka. Sometimes they're traveling to get away, and this is where they end up. And so it isn't just, Lawrence. They can come from everywhere. And also, to talk about what you said, Charlie, I should also say, as we do education around here, I make it very known to people that they should be listening to survivors and survivor-led knowledge, because there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of information about trafficking. And if they're not a survivor, I turn the page, because while they probably have great intentions, it's survivor-led people like Charlie that we should be listening to. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Charlie, for saying that, because that is what I do as an educator within the hospital.
Yeah, it's very brave. And it's got to be, it just has to be emotional every single time. And I'm just, every time I hear you speak, Charlie, it's fantastic. It really helps. And I would also add, I think we should also think about, Will, when you're asking this question, what does it look like? What do these services look like? We also have labor trafficking. And I think, just as Corey and Charlie told us, right, labor trafficking folks do visit medical settings as well, right? I think there's one study out that said 50 to 80% of trafficking persons who have been trafficked actually do visit a medical facility, and they aren't asked the questions, just like Charlie said, or somebody doesn't have a hunch, right? So we could have someone who's in the midst of a labor trafficking situation who could be seeking painkillers just to get back to work, and they might be tagged as drug seeking behavior, or they might have an excessive sunburn and people aren't paying attention, or an untreated chronic illness. Thankfully, we do have really good research out there now for protocols and identification of what labor trafficking how that can manifest as well, and what to look for. But I think you guys have identified it, right? Like this is one of those places. There are many others where identification can happen.
Hannah, can I follow up with that with you? Because I think there's one question, and I know we do tend to focus, I think, a little more on the survival sex and the sexual assault and sexual exploitation side, being a domestic violence center, and that's kind of more the world that we deal in. But there's one question that we get asked that I think is relevant to every type of trafficking. And it's one that comes up all the time, and that's in domestic violence is why didn't she just leave? It's usually a gendered question, which is why I'm saying it that way, but it's why don't they just leave? So let's talk about that in relation to, because we do get the same thing with human trafficking, and not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. Why don't people just leave that situation when they find themselves in it?
Did you wanted me to take the first stab at that?
Okay. You wouldn't mind, because with the base of both labor and
yeah. No, I think it's fine. And it's interesting because one of the biggest and first national labor trafficking cases happened here in Kansas, right? So if anybody out there wants to Google Giant Labor Solutions, it was one of the biggest trafficking cases in the country. And again, it was people who were, through fraud, brought to the United States to work. Passports were taken. They were forced to work as cleaning services in major hotel chains. And we could literally pass them. They would be cleaning our rooms and not have, we would have no idea, right? Neither did the hotel chains, right? But they're given negative paychecks. So they have to pay for room and board out of their paychecks. There's a significant infrastructure that can go into labor trafficking and sex trafficking, right? So fraud is a big component of it. Force, fraud, and coercion, right? And any number of those things can be added onto that. There's no one formula for how these things happen. But, you know, threats of loss of employment, threats of deportation, threats of losing your children, threats against your family, all of these things are there in both labor and sex trafficking, right? And it just depends on the situation, but I think that's really, really helpful. You know, it's interesting how when we do interviews with service providers, they tell us these amazing stories, and drug trafficking came up, and I think I was in a situation where like, well, that's drug trafficking. They said, no, they're drug trafficking in order to survive, right? This was another form of a service unwillingly given, but it's read, you know, in a framework that somebody is trafficking drugs, when in fact they're actually trafficking drugs in order to survive, right? So you guys can take it from there.
I also think the question is a little bit frustrating, just because, you know, it's like the culture says there has to be some reason why they're staying, when it's not my place to say why somebody stays in anything. I'm not walking in their shoes. I'm not living their life. And so it's sometimes a difficult question for me to answer, because I don't know. I'm not that person. I know I've done things in my life because I'm scared, you know, so I can empathize. But I think if we continue to culturally say, you know, ask this question, I think it just makes it harder. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes. I have a lot of thoughts about this question, but I think I can sum it up, especially in my frame with working with the youth, that there's always frustration coming from other service providers on like, why is this kid in this situation to begin with, and why aren't they leaving, or why do they keep running back there? Why do they keep running back to this place? And the easiest way for me to help people understand is that is the safest place that they know. And anything beyond that is scary. The unknown is scarier, and leaving a situation than knowing, or like staying in the situation where you know you can take the abuse and you know you can get through it. And so it's a very controversial question, but like survivors who are in that situation, when you're thinking about it, like the leaving part feels impossible. The person that you're with usually has groomed you to the point where you no longer feel like you can do it. You're not empowered to do it. And some of us don't have the support to be able to do it. And so just kind of putting together all the pieces and getting a whole picture is really actually quite simple to understand why people don't leave the situation. But the problem is society takes over, and they're like, oh, that should be easy, given their positions of privilege and not having to go through that situation in general, and not really being willing to put themselves outside of that and being like, oh, they shouldn't be running there. I'm like, well, I get it. If I'm looking from their lens, I get it. But it takes society and people being willing to step outside of themselves to be able to see what a survivor sees.
Well, a lot of times when I'm asked that question, I'll say, well, and then what? Okay, let's say they leave. Then what? What's your plan?
It's hard to leave. It is so hard.
Are you going to buy them a house? Are you going to get them a job? You know, so if you answer it with, well, okay, then what? What are they supposed to do? You know, it
the
feels
cost
good.
of housing.
Yeah,
It
feels good to say
criminal
let's get them
records.
out of this, but then what's the plan? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
My answer could be summed up in 3 words: lack of options. whether it's adult or a minor, these victims don't feel like they have any options. And so that's, to me, is the main reason why they don't leave, is nobody's giving them any better options than what they have right before them.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that it's a pretty open-ended question, and one that you know, I don't particularly like. I think the other argument that certainly around domestic violence that I really focus on with that question is, why are we putting it on the survivor to be the one to have to change the situation? Why is it not? Why don't they leave? Why do they feel it's okay to do this? And I think that's an important point as well. We do have somebody has come in with a question, so I'll just kind of put this one open to whoever feels like they would like to give it an answer. Diane writes, I worked with a woman at BNC and suspected she was being trafficked. I asked her about it and assured her that I would support any decision that she made. However, if she was being trafficked, she could tell me and we could figure it out from there. So in terms of handling situations in, say, the workplace where you suspect that somebody might be being trafficked, or you suspect that something's going on, is that a good way to handle it? What else can be done? What kind of are things that you can do if you suspect that there might be trafficking going on with someone that you know or work with? Anybody want to take a go with that one?
So if it's a child, there's more things I think that it's set up, because can call the abuse hotline. Human trafficking falls under child abuse, and so but if it's an adult, it becomes a little bit more complex. And if it's a coworker, I just need more context because each situation is so individualized. But I think if it's like a coworker, being available for support and being willing to empower that person to make the best decision that they want to make, because it will have to be their decision. And then being a springboard of discussing options and just walking someone through that and just not leaving their side. It's probably the best way of handling that without any other context.
Yeah, I mean, empowering them for it to be their decision is really the best thing you can do. And, you know, if their decision is, I don't want to do anything about that, well, I support that decision too. What can we do to make you safe back in that environment? And you know now that you can return here. And if that means you have to ask for me, or just say you're here for anything, once you're beyond these doors, they're locked. Sometimes that's as far as our conversation goes. I recently had a situation where I had to get resources out of town because the Willow was full, and, you know, with COVID, it's like places are limited. And so I had to work with someone else, and we actually had to send her back to the person waiting in the parking lot for her. But we kind of came up with this crazy plan, you know, for her to ditch this person. And that was really hard for me because I felt so uncomfortable knowing she was going back outside, and I saw this person, and I wouldn't want my worst enemy leaving with this person. And so that was a really difficult, but again, like, you always have to make it their decision. And because giving them back autonomy and empowering them is like the first step to recovery. And it matters, and they need to know that you're just there. And so it's really hard to say exactly the steps you do, except to say that I just try to make sure that the patient is the one making those decisions and reaching far as I can in terms of partners. And that's what I do a lot, be on task forces and have friends and neighbors, right, that I know can help me with a text or a phone call.
Just to follow up on we've got questions rolling in now, which is excellent. But just to follow up on that previous question, Diane wanted to clarify that it was a client that she was working with rather than a coworker. So my fault on that, Diane. I made an assumption, but thank you for the clarification. And she also wanted to clarify: is there a difference between being trafficked and selling your body for money?
So that's a topic.
Yeah, really,
It's a very controversial topic, depending on how you talk. And it's split in the survivor community as well. So my quick answer to that is yes, there is a difference. A lot of people disagree with me, including my good pal Rebecca Bender, who will probably be seeing this. So hey, Bex. So I will say that, like, if someone is an adult and consents to engaging in survival sex, that is their choice, as long as they are in control. The second they are not in control, then it's exploitation. If there's force, fraud, or coercion. And so that's kind of my bottom line. Anytime a youth is involved under the age of 18, federal legislation actually mandates that youth cannot consent to prostitution. So youth cannot engage with sex with, if they are being prostituted, or if they are allegedly prostituting themselves, they cannot do that. And so when cases come in and I hear law enforcement say, oh, they're prostituting themselves, I'm like, they're 14, 15 years old. They can't do that. Sorry. But it might look that way, but kids can't, adults can, in my opinion. Now, there are a lot of exploitive overtones to prostitution in general that we can spend 3 days on.
And
I think there's a lot of research out there that says that most adults who are involved in sex trafficking or prostitution start as minors. So again, we go back to them being exploited. So how much is it a choice for them? If they were exploited as a child, you know, are they still doing it of their own free will, or are they still doing it because of the trauma and the exploitation as they got as a child?
Yeah, and I would just try to bring back some of the things all of you have said previously, which is it's also how that person's defining it, right? So if we're going to actually listen to people, and maybe that's not the question we should be asking. If the issue is lack of options, right, which I love the 3 words, lack of options, what if we walk with folks and figure out what options they need to have a safety plan, or figure out what they need in order to have a roof over their head, or figure out what they need in order to get health care for their kid, right? So all of these are, you know, what options are out there? How can we help people get those options so then they can make choices themselves? I also was thinking, I don't know where to put this, Will, but we should probably put up a couple hotline numbers, or I guess you can do that later, because, you know, if they're in Douglas County, we can give them places to go, but also probably we can add these later, but the national hotline and the Kansas hotline as well might be useful resources for people like Diane who might just have questions they want to ask, right? Or what options are out there, right? They may not know, right? What options are out there.
absolutely, and we can definitely put all the hotline number, the national numbers, the state number, as well as local resources for the trafficking task force. So if folks have more questions, they can follow up on that. But thank you for that. Diane, it seems like maybe there's a little bit more research to be done on that particular question, but thanks for the great question. Stavros writes, greetings from Greece. So we're an international, but we're an international panel now. That's exciting. Do you believe that the United Nations definition of human trafficking is problematic? And that definition is listed. It is on the comments on the Facebook page if anybody wants to have a look at it. Recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means such as force, abduction, fraud, or coercion for an improper purpose, including forced labor or sexual exploitation. That is.
I'm going to let some of my other policy people deal with that one.
Yeah, Ken, Hannah, this.
I would just say when you're looking at something from a global view, it's gonna have to look very broad, right? You have to encompass when you're writing something globally, it's going to have to encompass a lot of terms because it's going to look different everywhere. Maybe not the nuances of it and like what we're talking about. Of course, that's going to be the same in every situation. But yeah, I think having to write something, a policy that is global, I think is really difficult. And it kind of has to be broad. I mean, Hannah, you'd probably be the best one to answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Was it Stavros? What was the name?
Stavros.
Stavros. You know, the U.S. law and the Palermo Protocols were written in the same year by many of the same people. So the definitions are very similar, and they both sort of prioritize the force, fraud, and coercion. So I think that's pretty universal. But I think Corey's right. Like for me, it may not be the definition that's the problem. It may be how countries operationalize and institutionalize this problem, right? Or domesticate this law. We've seen a lot of countries use trafficking law in an effort to curb immigration or to deport folks, right? So different countries can read these in very problematic ways, and we should pay attention to that. Many of them are doing wonderful things with the legislation, right? And are finding interesting ways to domesticate it. So paying more attention to child soldiers, right? That might not be something some countries pay attention to and other countries do, right? So there are ways that this can be domesticated down to the national level in really helpful ways, but also in really draconian ways. So I think for me, it's the other issue with the international is that it was written within a larger criminal framework. It was part of 3 different protocols. One of my graduate students, Laura Dean, educated me about this. So looking at she's now a professor, but looking at these within a criminal framework is also probably something that we might not want to do. What if we looked at it in terms of a human rights framework or in terms of a more compassionate framework, right? So to always read these things as criminal acts in some ways takes away the humanity of the survivors. So I mean, that would be my first take at the international level.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? All right. Well, this I'll tell you, the time is rolling by really, really quickly, and I'm very much enjoying everything that we have going on here. One question, and Ken, I think I'd like to kind of throw this your way to open up on it because we talked about it a little bit before. In terms of the amount of trafficking and trafficking related incidents that are happening, both in kind of the local community and in Kansas in general, have we seen an increase, decrease? I mean, you said there was a little bit of an increase in Western Kansas. What are the general trends with how trafficking is? How many incidents are being reported, and then how trafficking is being handled? Because I know that there has been a big emphasis sort of within the last like 6 to 7 years on trafficking cases. So can you talk a little bit to that?
It's complicated. It all depends, I guess. You look at it from 2 perspectives. One is the criminal perspective on going after those traffickers who are trafficking these people, or whether you're looking at it from a public health issue and you're trying to provide services and help to the victims. I can tell you right now across the state, criminally, prosecutions are down. And I think a lot of that has to do with COVID-19 and the fact that law enforcement has been tasked with dealing with COVID-19 related issues and budget restraints and things like that. So I think that's why it's down as far as criminal prosecutions. As far as, I haven't seen much difference as far as Department for Children and Families. We're still identifying victims. We're still providing them services. So I haven't seen a real decrease since COVID-19, but more probably on the prosecutorial side, I've seen a decline. You know, I think that has a lot to do with COVID-19, and we're just too busy doing COVID-19 related issues than to go out there and address trafficking like we have in the past.
How about other folks in kind of the service area? Charlie, Corey, have you seen a increase, decrease in sort of services or incidents?
I think from the perspective of somebody that has been doing the human trafficking assessments, there really hasn't been much change in how many are coming through, because the courts are ordering them, and there are reports that are coming through just like they always have. So I don't think that we've seen much of a change there. I will say that with the additional training that folks are receiving, there are more, I think, case managers and teachers and like people that are in contact with the youth are getting better about bringing forth the right amount or the right signs, so we can look further into a situation and determine whether or not it is trafficking that's going on. So I think that folks are just kind of waking up to what those signs are, and so that's gotten better. We're having much more conversations, and the situations may end up not being trafficking, but at least the conversations are being had to help them learn more about it, to be able to identify it.
I think the 5 years that I've been doing this work, I've never had a situation where someone who's been identified as being trafficking or telling me they're being trafficked, that it involves police. A lot of times it's not even involving a SANE exam, even though one is warranted. It's really just involving shelter. Where can I go? Like, I can't go back out there. I'm thinking of a person in particular that was kicked out of her home right when COVID started because she lost her job. And she's like, I cannot do this on the street. And so I've not really experienced anything with law enforcement. And to be clear, I don't work with children, so I don't want you to think that I'm not calling police if they're young, a youth, which of course we are, but most of the time I'm dealing with people that are really, their need is to get somewhere safe, and that's really what we're working on. And so I have not really seen any prosecutions, or even in sexual assault. I've been a SANE nurse for 5 years and I've only been to court one time. So I don't know if it's a cultural problem. I don't know why, but it's just not stuff that I see being prosecuted in our community.
Thank you. Diane had a follow-up question to that question, which was, I think Candace is referring to something you were talking about, with there is a trafficker focus and sort of serving survivors is our focus. Is there any focus on the people that are frequenting the victims for sexual encounters? For those
like
who
buyers.
Yeah.
You're talking about buyers.
Yes, buyers. Yes.
Yeah, there
Um,
has
Go
been.
ahead, Ken.
There has been. The Kansas Attorney General's office has been focusing on buyers for a couple years now. And I know a lot of communities are doing what we call stings on human trafficking buyers and for sex trafficking specifically. So I think there is emphasis being done on that aspect of trafficking. And Charlie, I turn it over to you. I think you have something to say, reference it.
I know there are several groups that are focusing on that, and specifically in the Johnson County area. The one thing that I'm not seeing that it would like to be seeing is like more punishment for Johns, because there really isn't much out there as far as punishment for Johns and buying sex. And usually what I have found is that, like, and why I take the perspective I do on sex work this is the entire reason why, is because the ones that see getting the arrest are the victims. They're the ones that are arrested. The Johns are kind of slapped on the wrist and sent home. So that is definitely an area that needs some major adjustment. And I have seen some great conversations and sincere movements forward on that area.
Great. Well, I think I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So what I'd like to go ahead and do now is get a last shout out for anybody. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments. But as we're sort of drawing to a close here, can I ask each of you, are there resources or last thoughts that you have or things to think about, places to go if you want more information on different aspects of trafficking? Any place that you would highly recommend, any websites, events, that sort of thing? I know we can obviously talk up the Douglas County Human Trafficking Task Force, and I hope that we will get to do something like this again because it was hugely helpful. But Hannah, would you want to kick us off and just any resources or places to go for further info?
Yeah, and I would I think I can do this succinctly, hopefully. I think there are a lot of people who really want to get involved and help. And I think Charlie and I have talked about this before. Sometimes the single worst thing about the movement is folks in the movement, right? Like we have to be very careful. There are a lot of people who might be in this movement for not the right reasons, right? So when students come to me and say, what can I do to help? I usually say, work on affordable housing, go volunteer at the Willow, go work at Boys Club and Girls Club. Let's figure out ways to make a community stronger and healthier as a community, make housing affordable, make sure people have health insurance. So I would say if you want to get involved, use some of the existing resources. If you don't have an anti-trafficking organization in your area, you probably do have an English as second language program that you could volunteer at. You could work for migrant labor organizations. So there are lots of ways to get involved, I would say, that are already existing in your community.
Thank you.
I think if there's anybody out there listening that's in the community that is a provider or a medical provider or a medical professional, I would suggest teaching yourself and getting more information how to deliver what's called trauma-informed care. I think it's not just about understanding what trafficking is, but understanding our role in caring for people and understanding that people have so much more to them than that broken ankle. And we alluded to those questions that were asked earlier, are you safe at home? Yes, we're asking those questions now because a lot of money and a lot of research has been done, like these are important, but what's not being done is teaching us how to ask those questions, okay? They're just being handed to us. They're not saying this is how you ask it. So sometimes we're asking that question while someone's doubled over in pain, which is not helpful. Nobody's going to answer that question at that moment. And so if you are a medical person and you really want to get involved, study trauma-informed care, look into what that is, change your practice, figure out a way to make every patient in front of you comfortable enough to share with you what's important for their entire holistic picture.
If you're looking for resources, I can give you a couple national resources. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a lot of resources on minor sex trafficking. And then the Polaris Project also has a lot of resources, not only for minor, but adult sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So those are two national resources I would go to.
Those two national resources you just gave are like the two top for like working with survivor leaders and getting feedback from survivor leaders. So they're excellent. And the Kansas response team works with them on a daily basis pretty much. And so I would double down on those suggestions. There's also, there's a couple of local survivor leaders. I know Lucy and Christy over at Veronica's Voice have a survivor-led organization that works with adult women who have been trafficked, and you should, looking to get involved in direct service, they offer training. And then there's a drop-in center by Christine McDonald. Karen Countryman has some good things going in Wichita on the survivor leader front. So support your local survivor leaders, and then check out Rebecca Bender and Audrey Morrissey. More than a survivor resources. And so good way to get involved in a movement is to check out the people who it has affected directly. There's a lot of us out there speaking about it.
I will just I'll just close by saying that, you know, these are all excellent resources. I'll make sure to list them all. Also, many of the folks that are here are either directly responsible for or know folks who can provide presentations and more information and more resources if you'd like that for a group or organization. And if you have any questions, you can always call the Willow 24-hour hotline at 785-843-3333. Thank you all so much for coming on today. I hope we can do this again before next January. I feel like this should be a quarterly thing or something. So we can there's so much more we could have talked about, and I really appreciate all of your time. If you have any further questions, I'll put my email on the link below, and you can feel free to send me an email, and I'll filter it on to whoever it is for, and we can communicate that way, and we can let you know what you need to know. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks, panelists. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate your time.
Good to see you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.